All right, in this lesson, I wanted to dive a bit into the axes of a panel, which is basically the components that make up this three-dimensional object. So I'll begin by re-executing our code to load our information for our 5 companies into our P panel using the Pandas Data Reader library. And once this loads, I actually wanted to take a deeper look into what all these lines below here are indicating to us and then explore some additional attributes that are available on a Pandas panel. So let's begin with this first line, which says dimensions. So as I mentioned, a panel can be thought of as a box of data frames. And this very first number here is telling us how many data frames are being stored within it. So we have 5 total data frames. That's our very first number. Now, you would think, just because we put in 5 different companies here, that each one of these data frames is going to represent one of our 5 tech companies. But in fact, each one of those outer data frames actually represents one of the financial data points that is being stored in Google Finance. So it's a little bit confusing at first, but that's just the way that the data reader library returns it to us. But basically, we have 5 data frames here. Within each one of those data frames, we have rows and columns. This next number here is telling us the number of rows that exist within each one of those 5 data frames. So within those 5 data frames, we have 1,709 total rows. Keep in mind that if you are running this in the future, which you obviously will be, and your end date is pushed forward, you're going to get a greater number here because you're going to get more rows of results. Also, by the way, keep in mind, I may alternate in the order in which I record these lessons, so you may see a different number for me here as well from time to time. Just feel free to ignore it. It doesn't affect the general lesson. But this basically means the number of rows that we're getting in each one of those 5 data frames. And finally, predictably, this last number here, which is 5, indicates the number of columns within each one of those inner data frames within the panel. And this is actually the minor axis, is where we're storing those 5 company names. So kind of again, to give you the larger picture, we have this panel. We have 5 total data frames within it, and if we reach into that panel and pull out one of those 5 data frames, it's going to have 1,709 rows and 5 columns, and those 5 columns are going to be our 5 tech companies. Now, how do we find out the values of each one of those 3 axes, or each one of those dimensions within our panel object? Well, Pandas is basically giving us a brief hint here where it's giving us 2 values from each one, basically the start point and the end point. So it's telling us that the items axis, which is the most outer layer, which represents the number of data frames, basically has 5 data frames, and they range from open to volume. Now I can use an attribute here called items, and that's going to load a list of those data frames for us. So this is the most external layer of our panel. And here are the 5 data frames that are available to us: open, high, low, closed, and volume. So these 5 are represented here in this very first dimension here, 5 total items. And these choices represent what's called the items axis, which you can see listed here. That's the most outer layer. This listing right below the cell is basically giving it to us from the most external layer, and then it's proceeding downwards and inner and showing us the remaining layers. After we pick one of those 5 data frames from this list, we proceed to a data frame object that has rows and columns. The rows make up what's called the major axis of each data frame, and predictably those are going to be dates. The first date is going to start at January 4th, 2010 and proceed all the way to October 17th, 2016. And of course, if we wanted to pull out a list of all of those dates, there is a major axis attribute. So if I do p.major_axis, and it is an attribute, so it does not need parentheses, this is going to basically give us a list or a datetime index of timestamps that represent the row labels within each one of my 5 data frames. So once again, we have 5 data frames in our panel. Here they are. If we pick any one of these 5, we're going to get a data frame, and in that data frame, these are going to be the rows. And finally, we have our columns, which of course the only remaining variable here is our company names. So predictably, the columns are called the minor axis, and they're going to store our 5 company names. In this case, this output is just telling us the first and last one, which is Apple and Yahoo. If we want to see all the values of our minor axis or our columns, there is a complementary minor axis attribute, and predictably that's going to give us a list of the 5 column names, or in this case the 5 tech companies that make up any one of our 5 data frames. So we have the items axis, the major axis, and the minor axis, and we actually have a attribute that's available on a panel called axes, and what that does is basically bundle them up into one final result. So if I show you the result of this axes attribute, it's basically going to give me a list. The very first item in this list is going to be the items axis, which represents our 5 data frames. The next item in this axes list is going to be our major axis, which represents the date times or the timestamps. And finally, the last item represents the column names, which are called the minor axis. So just to reiterate the point that I introduced in the last lesson, we basically just have 3 axes, which basically means 3 dimensions. So imagine that this is our data set, and our boss comes to us and they say something like, I want you to give me the information for the stock on, let's say, January 12th, 2010. Let's say they select this date. That's giving me one piece of information, and that's not enough for me to figure out what the boss is talking about, because I don't know either the company that they're referring to or the specific piece of stock information, for example, the opening price or the closing price or the volume that the boss wants me to extract. Let's say that they give me 2 pieces of information. Let's say they say, okay, I want you to get me the volume, and I want you to get me the volume on October 17, 2016. Well, now they're giving me 2 pieces of information. That's still not enough because I don't know what company of our 5 they're referring to. I don't know whether they mean Amazon or Google or so on. It's only at the point that I have 3 points of reference that I can actually locate a specific value. Once I have a date, once I have a company name, and once I have the specific stock point that they'd like to extract, for example, I want volume on October 17, 2016 for Microsoft. Once I have those 3 pieces of information, only then can I extract the specific value at that point. So because we need 3 pieces, it's a 3-dimensional object, as simple as that. And the items attribute, the major axis attribute, and the minor axis attribute can help us get a sense of each one of those layers of reference that we need in order to extract any specific point. So just to conclude with a quick review, we have 3 layers. We have the items axis, which represents the most outer layer of data frames. In this case, it represents these values right here. Each one of these will yield a separate data frame. Within each data frame, we have 1,709 rows. Those rows make up what's called the major axis, and you can see all of those values listed here. And within any one of those 5 data frames, we also have 5 columns. Those make up the minor axis, and you can see their values represented here. If you want to see all 3 of these parts bundled together, you can get them in the axes attribute. So hopefully this is starting to give you a bigger sense or a greater sense of how a pandas panel object works. And in the next lesson, we'll continue diving into some of the attributes that are available on this pandas panel object.